In this video, I will visually explain how a Roman legion camp was designed. Selection of site, fortifications, placement of cohorts and centuries, and two versions of the layout of the camp. Let's go through the basics and touch on some curious questions. For example, why camels live in the camp next to marines? There were two types of Roman legion camps: Castra hiberna, winter camp, also known as a fort, a fortification with permanent stone buildings and various facilities, sometimes even bases and amphitheatre, and Castra aestiva, summer or marching field camp. It was set up at the end of each day's march and destroyed in the morning. By the way, it was called summer camp because all military operations took place mainly in the warm season. As a Roman legion marched to its destination, at the end of each day it stopped and set up the camp. This was not done as a random thing, but according to a careful plan. Duties were clearly divided between units and legionaries. As the camp itself always had a standard layout, and this allows the camp to be set up in just a few hours. How would we know about that? Because a field camp is basically tents, some earth and wood, and that's not gonna last. Plus, when the Roman troops left the camp, they destroy it. That's right, there is no archaeological evidence to tell us exactly how the camp was laid out. Therefore, we have to rely only on texts and some artifacts, such as pieces of leather that made up the tent or metal pegs, also for the tent. There are several ancient authors who wrote about Roman legion's camp organization, for example Polybius, Josephus Flavius, Vegetius, and Pseudo-Hyginus. The field camps described by them have some differences, probably related to the evolution of the Roman camp. After all, more than 2 centuries passed between Polybius and Pseudo-Hyginus. The place for camp was carefully chosen. Often this was done by one of the tribunes, and sometimes by the commander itself. The campsite had to be located on open ground and preferably on a hill that would give good vantage point, or on the slope of the hill, which would also provide a water drainage. In case of enemy danger, it was a slope facing to enemy. There must be a water source nearby. However, it was considered dangerous to be located directly on a riverbank because of the possibility of flooding of the camp. Also, the terrain nearby should not give the enemy an opportunity to hide. Places with dominant heights nearby should be avoided. Once the site was chosen, the engineers began marking out the future camp. There are two main schemes for the organization of Roman field camp. The first description belongs to Polybius, and second later to Pseudo-Hyginus, and is probably a kind of development of the one described by Polybius. The camp described by Polybius was intended to accommodate 2 legions. It was square in shape. Let me remind you that at the beginning the camp was marked out by the engineering units that arrived on the spot. Then a rampart and a ditch were built, and only then the tents were installed. But for the sake of clarity, I will set up the tents first. First, the location of the consul's tent was decided. On the sides were a forum and a questorium. The questorium was used to house enemy ambassadors and hostages, as well as the loot. In front of the consul's tent was the tribune's tent in a row. Further away were the prefects. Behind and slightly to the sides, space was allocated to the consul's guard, extraordinary, and allied troops. There was a street in front of tribune's tent. Behind it, the legions were to be positioned. The site of the camp where the legions stay had to be convenient for foraging and have access to water. In the center of the street was placed a groma, an ancient geodesic tool. It allowed you to draw straight lines on the ground, plus perpendiculars to those lines. The center point of the camp is also sometimes called groma, after the name of the tool. And groma was also the name of the monumental entrance to the central building of the Roman fort. Here is a groma from the fort in Algeria. After the groma was installed, everything else could be marked out. Another street is planned perpendicular to the first one. It runs from the tribune stand all the way to the camp's gate. In the middle part of the camp, where the legion was stationed, there was another street. As Polybius writes, it is called fifth quintana, because it stretches along the fifth units. Each squad has its own place, and the flag was placed there. This location was determined in advance and did not change. Therefore, each troop on arrival knew where it should be positioned, and having divided at the gate, they quickly went to the place of their accommodation. What were the names of other streets? Polybius only mentions Quintana. The street that ran along the tribune stand was probably called Via Principalis, but as for the perpendicular street, here I do not have a definitive answer. On a numerous schemes on the web, Polybius' plan is interpreted slightly differently. Sometimes it is labeled as Via Praetoria and sometimes as Via Decumana. And it's the same story with the gates. Sometimes behind the council stand is the Porta Praetoria, sometimes Porta Decumana. Most likely, however, that Porta Decumana was located at the opposite end of the camp from the Praetorium, where the 10th cohorts were located. Therefore, the name Porta Decumana. The Porta Decumana are set up at the highest point, so that the area is controlled from the camp. The Porta Praetoria must always face to the enemy. Between the square where the troops were stationed and the rampart was an open space called Intervallum. Its width was 200 feet, about 70 meters, and as Polybius wrote, this empty space is of important service in several respects. It was necessary because in night attacks missiles cannot reach the tents. Also, it provided a quick movement of troops along the perimeter of the camp, and captured cattle were also kept there. So, the plan is marked out and the external dimensions are determined. Now the soldiers who arrived on the site start leveling the surface. Then the simplest fortification structures are built around the perimeter. A ditch is dug, in Latin it was called fossa, and the excavated earth was used to build a rampart, ager. The depth of the ditch was about 1 meter. The same height was the rampart. And in case of close proximity of the enemy, the ditch could reach 3 meters in depth and 4 meters in width. A rampart also could be built from the ground covered with the turf, or from the stone, if there was a stone on the side of the camp. Isn't it too difficult to fortify at the end of each day? Through experiments, it has been found that 100 men can cover the area required for the deployment in 2 hours. How this can be extrapolated to accommodate thousands of soldiers is for you to decide. But the fact that the legion built a small rampart is so often mentioned that it's not in doubt. And by the way, look at what is next to Mossad's fortress, the remains of Roman legion ramparts. You can see even a special way of organizing the entrance to the camp. And here is a couple more images taken with the lidar in Spain. The gates are of the same design. A palisade could have been erected on the top. In Latin, it is called vallum. Stakes carried by the legionaries were used for this purpose, but if the terrain allowed, it could be tree trunks with the branches, and such things were called stacks or cervoli. The ramparts could be enhanced with the towers at the corners. If the camp was placed directly in front of the enemy, the cavalry and some of the infantry would line up in front of the rampart line in combat order, while the rest of the soldiers built the fortifications. As the rampart was being built, the council could withdraw the infantry from the guarding. The cavalry did not leave their position until the completion of the rampart. The camp has 4 gates. It wasn't a gate in a literal sense of the word. Rather, it was a fortified pathway into the camp. All that was required of such an entrance was to slow down the enemy in case of an attack. 3 types of gates are known. The first, titulus, is a small barrier parallel to the line of fortifications. The second, clavicular, translated as a key or a plug, when the fortification continued inwards and outwards, forming 2 quarters of the circle. And note that they should be turned in such a way that the enemy turns the right unprotected side to the rampart. And the third is agricolon. It looked something like this. And that is exactly what was used in the camps on the images. The camp is marked and fortifications are constructed. It's time to pitch our tents and set up the camp. On the sides of this street, the first and the second legion are starting to set up. The first row are occupied by mounted units, followed by maniples of triarii, then the principes, and last are gastati. The legionaries lived in a small tent of 8 men. The centurions had the private tent. Although it shouldn't be forgotten that not all the space is taken up by the tents. There was also a room for cattle and horses. And here, on both sides, could be located allied units if they accompanied the legion. The next detailed description of a Roman camp can be found in a work entitled De Munitionibus Castrorum. The authorship is usually attributed to the Pseudo-Hyginus, but most likely it was created in the 2nd century under Trajan or Marcus Aurelius. The first difference from Polybius' camp is the shape. The camp changes from a square to a rectangle with the aspect ratio of 2:3, and the organization of the internal space is also changed. Pseudo-Hyginus is much more specific with the names of the parts of the camp. Via Principalis and Via Quintana divide the camp into 3 parts: Praetentura, Retentura, and Latera Praetoria. The Praetentura is divided in half by Via Praetoria. Around the camp is also an Intervallum and Via Segularis. This gate is called the Porta Praetoria. The opposite end of the camp is the Porta Decumana. The gates to which Via Principalis approaches are Porta Principalis Dextra and Porta Principalis Sinistra, right and left respectively. The possibility of an additional Porta Quintanae gate is also mentioned. This was done in case of several legions gathered in the camp. The Praetorium is now in the central part between Via Principalis and Via Quintana. At the entrance to the Praetorium and in the middle part of Via Principalis is a place called Groma. Here the army will gather. The Questorium is located in the center of Retentura. This is where the spoils and hostage ambassadors were kept. The altars were placed at the end of the Praetorium. The place for the Auguratorium was at the right hand of the Praetorium, just behind the Via Principalis, so that the commander could correctly perceive the omens. To the left of the Praetorium, a tribunal is built. From there, commander, having finished the divination by the flight of birds, informs the army of favorable omens. The tents of legatus and tribunus are located on the other side of the Via Principalis, somewhere around there. The workshops, veterinary services, and hospital should also be located in Praetentura, and the last one should be far away from the workshops because the convalescents need silence. However, it's not clear where exactly in Praetentura it was located. The rest of the space of the Praetentura, Latera Praetoria, and Retentura was occupied by the alas and cohorts, and let's see how they were arranged. You all know that 8 legionaries made up a contubernium, and 10 of them made up a century. One contubernium occupies an area of 12 by 30 feet. 10 feet for tent, 5 feet for arms, 9 for pack animals, and 6 feet were left free. The tents where the century was housed were lined up in rows of 120 feet long. Such an area was called hemistrigum. The first tent was occupied by a centurion, and if you think that there are not enough tents for the remaining legionaries, you're right. The text explains that century needs fewer tents because each century allocates legionaries who are on the guard. The 2 centuries were placed face to face. This area was called striga and was 60 feet wide. 30 feet for the century on one side and 30 on the other. And as you remember, 6 feet was left free, so there was a 12-foot gap between the centuries, somewhere around 4 meters. Hello and salute! I am Maria, the author, the voice and the artist of this video. A few words about the concept of this channel. I have two main hobbies, it's history and drawing. And in the past, when I was thinking about making a YouTube channel, I could not decide what kind of channel it should be, about history or about drawing. But then I realized that I could try to combine these two things into one channel. Some topics are perfectly matched with the drawing format. For example, explanation of evolution of the Roman helmets, the next video. I'm just at the beginning of my journey to find the right format of this channel. But probably, with your help, with your likes and subscriptions, some kind of a new genre of historical videos would appear on YouTube. And it's very disappointing to have 0 subscribers, because it took me over 35 hours to make this video. And now, let's get back to the camp. The deployment of the cohorts could have been organized in several ways. Like this, or like this. The most reliable cohorts are proposed to be placed along the Via Segularis. They would guard the camp and keep the less reliable units from the running away. Depending on number of legions stationed in the camp, the first cohorts with double numbers were placed near Porta Praetoria and on either side of Praetorium. In the Praetenture, the troops are arranged in the following way: legatus and tribunes along the Via Principalis, followed by a cavalry ala, for example, miliari or quingenari alae, in other words, 1,000 or half a thousand alas. The Moorish cavalry and the Pannonian light horsemen are also placed in the Praetenture, and then the infantry. Along the Via Praetoria, as you remember, the first cohorts. Also, here all the marines were stationed, because they are first to leave the camp to build roads. When the marines are working, they are protected by the Moorish cavalry and Pannonian light horsemen. For this reason, marines should be quartered immediately behind the cohorts, and also scouts should be placed in a row of the first cohort. And if it now seems to you that there are too many troops here, and it's never been like this before, I would like to remind you that this is some kind of ideal camp. There are even camels here. Listen to this quote. We will assign 5 feet to each of the camels with the drivers. If they are to be used against the enemy, they should camp in the Praetenture, next to marines. But if they are there to carry booty, they should camp in the Questorium. The camp in Pseudo-Hyginus description has a capacity of 42,000. Here is the list. But in any case, the description itself is useful and interesting. After all, the principles of organization themselves were probably followed. They simply changed the proportions according to the size of army and the presence of certain types of troops. But let's get back to our ideal Pseudo-Hyginus camp. In the Latera Praetoria, the arrangement was as follows. Praetorian cohorts should be placed on other side of Praetorium and allocated to them, compared to legion cohorts, twice as much space, because they use larger tents. The Praetorian cavalry should be placed to the right and the emperor's equites singularis to the left of the Praetorium. The primipili and evocati, re-enlisted veterans, are somewhere in the same place. Miliari and quingenari alae should camp on the sides of the Praetorium, if the space allows. Quingenary infantry units are above the first cohorts. And as a reminder, here are the first cohorts, and here are all the others. In the Retenture, along the Questorium, near the Via Quintana, there were centurions of the guard to cover the rear of the Praetorium and generally to be close to it. Above them, as far as space allows, quingenary infantry or part-mounted cohorts. In other rows, along the Via Quintana, there are infantry or mounted cohorts, and above them there are allies and other tribes. And above it's towards the Porta Decumana. And one more thing about the terms. There is a place or area in the camp called Decumana, and it is not quite clear to me where exactly it is located and what area it occupies. So now I will tell you everything that I have learned, and you could write in the comments what you think about it. Let's start with the quote. The area above the praetorium at the gate level is called Decumana, because that is where 10th cohort is located, and at the gate level, meaning this gate right here, Porta Decumana, so it's definitely somewhere around here. There is an interpretation that, like the Quintana, Decumana divides the cohorts, in this case the 9th and the 10th. And here is the 5th, Quintana, and here is the 10th, Decumana. Further there, you could find a statement that the Via Decumana, and by the way, Via Decumana doesn't occur in Pseudo-Hyginus, and where it came from, I don't know. So that Via Decumana ran from Porta Praetoria to Porta Decumana. And as you can see, it is perpendicular to the previous assumption about the street between 9th and 10th cohorts. I might also add that in the Roman city there is a street called Decumanus. Decumanus Maximus and Cardo Maximus are the two main streets in the Roman city. They intersected at right angles, and in the middle was usually a forum. And it's believed that the name came from the layout of Roman camps. The only assumption that comes to my mind is that in the schemes and Wikipedia there was a confusion of concepts concerning the city and the camp, but not even a field camp, but a stationary one, Castra hiberna, in other words, fort, which was a small city. And in the field camp, the questorium and praetorium are located on the side of the Via Decumana. Thank you for watching and for your interest to the ancient Rome history. See you in the next video about the evolution of Roman helmets.